By the time I buttered the second piece of toast, my husband had already called my mother's house the property twice. The first time I told myself I was being too sensitive. The second time I felt something cold slide down through my ribs and settle there. Outside the kitchen window, the February light looked thin and metallic, the kind of Ohio winter light that made even the neighbor's red pickup seem faded. The coffee maker had just clicked off. My heart-shaped sugar cookies from the night before were lined up on a cooling rack beside the stove, their pink icing gone matty overnight. It was Valentine's Day, and the radio on the counter was playing one of those old love songs that always sounded sweeter than real life. Evan stood at the sink in his white shirt and dark slacks, knotting his tie with one hand while he drank coffee with the other. He looked neat in the effortless way some men do, like his life agreed with him. He glanced toward the hallway cabinet where I kept the house papers and said, "We should go over the property file tonight before your sister gets here." Not the house, not my mother's house. Not even our place, though he used that sometimes when he wanted to sound affectionate. The property file. I kept my eyes on the toast. "We can talk tonight." He nodded like I had agreed with something reasonable. Good. That was part of what made him so hard to resist. He never pushed with heat. He pushed with calm. He could make pressure sound like organization and hesitation sound like emotional instability. By the time you realized you had been cornered, the room still looked polite. I carried his plate to the table and sat across from him, tucking one foot under the other leg of my chair the way I always did when I wanted to feel smaller in a room. He reached for my hand and squeezed it once. "I'm not trying to upset you, Clara." "I know." That was my first lie of the day. My mother's house sat on a quiet street in Kettering, with a sagging porch step Evan kept saying he would fix when the weather warmed. It was a narrow two-bedroom with old maple floors and a row of blue plates my mother had hung near the dining room archway before I was born. When she died, I was 19, old enough to understand loss and still too young to understand how quickly other people turned grief into logistics. The house came to me because she wanted it that way. That had been written down. That had been settled. But in the years after, there was always some tone in the room whenever it came up, as if what came from my mother's side of life was softer than everything that came later. More sentimental. More negotiable. Mara never said it quite like that. My sister was too smart for bluntness. She was 7 years older than me, and had the clipped, efficient voice of someone who had long ago decided feelings were best handled like paperwork, quickly, correctly, and with the proper tabs. Our stepfather Richard preferred words like practical and fair and future-minded. Evan had started sounding more like both of them in the last year, and I tried not to notice that too much. I worked 3 days a week at the Montgomery County Historical Society, cataloging donated letters, maps, church ledgers, and family records no one else had time to care about. I liked old handwriting and quiet rooms, and the feeling that somebody's life could still matter because a page had survived. Evan used to say that was one of the things he loved about me. He said I took small things seriously. Lately he said it in a different tone. That afternoon I left work early to finish getting the house ready. Mara and Richard were coming for dinner. That part had started as Evan's idea 3 days earlier, when he said it would be good for everyone to sit down and clear the air. I had asked what air needed clearing, and he had only given me that patient look of his, the one that made me feel as if I had somehow missed a meeting everyone else had attended. By 5:30, the table was set with my mother's cream-colored dishes, the ones with the tiny green vine around the edge. I made pot roast because Richard liked it, and because Valentine's Day had started to feel too delicate for candlelit pasta and wine. The house smelled like onions, rosemary, and the buttery rolls warming in the oven. I had put fresh tulips in a mason jar at the center of the table, pale pink and drooping a little from the grocery store bucket. Not pretty enough for a magazine, but pretty enough for a family dinner if the family wanted one. When Mara came in, she kissed the air near my cheek and handed me a box of chocolates like I was hosting a shower. Richard stamped snow off his boots on the mat and called from the doorway, "Smells good in here." Evan came from the living room, smiling, already easy, already folded into the room, in a way I never quite was in my own house when the three of them were together. We sat down. Richard carved. Mara asked how work was. Evan poured the wine. For a few minutes it almost felt normal, the way bad dynamics often do at first. That was the problem with them. If they were ugly all the time, nobody would stay. Then Richard dabbed his mouth with his napkin and said, "So, have you two made any progress on the house situation?" He did not look at me when he asked it. He looked at Evan. I felt my fork stop in my hand. Evan answered before I could. "Not yet." Mara gave me a small smile that already carried disappointment. Clara's still feeling protective. It was such a little sentence. So mild, so polished. But I felt it land in the middle of the table like something wet and private. "Protective," I repeated. Mara lifted one shoulder. You know what I mean. I did know what she meant. She meant emotional. She meant attached in the wrong way. She meant younger than the rest of them. Richard leaned back in his chair. Nobody's trying to take anything from you, honey. But you're married now. At some point, you have to stop treating the place like a museum piece. The room got very still around me. Even the radiator by the window seemed to pause between clicks. My mother's blue plates were on the wall 10 feet away. Her dish towel with the faded lemons was hanging from the oven handle. The scratch on the floor near the back hall was where she had once dropped a dresser drawer and laughed so hard she cried. Every corner of that house had held me after she died in ways people never did. But sitting there with my husband beside me and my family across from me, I felt suddenly foolish for knowing any of that. Evan set down his glass. What Richard's saying is that shared assets make marriages stronger. Richard, not my stepfather. Richard, as if the room had become a meeting and titles were less useful than alignment. I looked at Evan. The house isn't a shared asset. His face changed very slightly. Not anger. Correction. That's exactly the kind of language that keeps us stuck, he said. I heard Mara exhale softly through her nose, almost a laugh, almost sympathy. I put down my fork before my hand shook enough for anyone to see it. It's not language. It's legal. Mara leaned in, folding her hands. Clara, nobody is denying your name is on the paperwork. We're talking about what marriage looks like when two adults build a life together. Two adults. There it was. I was in the room, but I had somehow become the younger, less formed version of myself they could all still talk over. I am building a life, I said. With one foot still in grief, Mara said quietly. That hurt because it was almost true. The best lies usually are. No one said anything for a moment. Evan did not defend me. He only stared at the table as if this too were part of a difficult but necessary conversation I was making harder than it needed to be. I looked at him and waited for something for him to say, enough for him to say, this is her home, for him to remember that Valentine's Day was supposed to belong to us, not to this strange tribunal in my dining room. Instead, he said, I can't keep proving I'm your husband to a house. My ears rang. Richard pushed his plate back. Mara reached for her wine. Nobody looked shocked. That was the worst part. The sentence did not land like an argument gone too far. It landed like the next logical point in a discussion that had been happening longer than I knew. Dinner ended soon after that, not with a blow-up, but with the tidy exhaustion of people who believed they had tried their best. Mara hugged me with one arm in the hallway and said, think about what kind of future you're choosing. Richard kissed the top of my head and told me not to be stubborn. I stood on the porch while they drove off, my bare feet cold inside my socks, and watched their taillights disappear at the corner. When I came back in, Evan was in our bedroom pulling shirts from hangers. I stopped in the doorway. What are you doing? He did not turn around right away. I'm going to stay at Caleb's for a few days. The room tilted, not dramatically, just enough to make every object look a little less trustworthy. My lavender sweater was folded on the chair. His watch was on the dresser. The bed I had made that morning was still smooth except where his suitcase lay open across it. You're leaving, I said. He finally looked at me. His expression was tired, almost sorrowful, and I hated him a little for how decent he looked wearing it. I'm stepping back, he said. Because I can't do this anymore. Do what lies inside your suspicion. Your mother is gone, Clara. This house is not a marriage. I have bent myself around your fear for 3 years. That was the moment I felt the humiliation fully. Not at the table, not even when Mara used that voice on me. Here in the bedroom on Valentine's Day, while he packed as if I had driven him to it by refusing to become easier to absorb. I could have shouted then. I could have asked him whether this dinner had been planned as cover, whether he had invited them to help him say things he was too careful to say alone. But I knew how that would sound once it left my mouth. Like panic, like instability, like proof. So I stood there with my hands at my sides and said, if you walk out tonight, don't call it stepping back. He zipped the suitcase. I hope you calm down enough to hear what everybody's been trying to tell you. Everybody. He carried the bag past me. In the hallway, he paused, reached into the cabinet drawer near the front closet and set a large manila envelope on the side table beneath the mirror. When you're ready, he said. Then he left. I listened to his car start back out and fade down the street. The house became painfully quiet after that, the way a church does after a funeral, when the last person finally stops talking. For a long minute, I stood by the front door staring at the envelope. Then I picked it up and carried it to the dining room table. One of Mara's lipstick marks was still on the rim of her wineglass. The tulips had already started opening wider in the heat. Inside the envelope was a transfer packet clipped neatly with signature tabs marked in yellow. I told myself I was only looking so I would know what I was refusing. The first page was a draft deed instrument. The second was a property rights agreement. My name appeared again and again in phrases that made me feel both over-explained and erased. Then I saw the preparation date in the corner. I looked at it once, then again. February 3rd, 11 days ago. I turned to the next page. Same date. The next one, too. Valentine's Day had not broken anything open. They had already been building the exit while he was still kissing me goodbye in the kitchen. I sat there with the packet open in front of me until the radiator clicked back on and the room remembered how to make noise. February 3rd. I kept staring at the date as if my eyes might have added it out of panic. 11 days earlier, Evan had come home with Thai takeout and kissed my forehead while I stood at the sink rinsing rice from a saucepan. 11 days earlier, he had asked if I wanted to drive out on Sunday and look at that flea market in Springfield once the weather broke. 11 days earlier, he had already been carrying papers designed to loosen my hands from the house. The part that hurt most was not the planning. It was the normalcy around it. I went to bed without changing the sheets and slept in my sweater on top of the blanket. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up, cold and disoriented, reached across the mattress for him and found the flat untouched half of the bed. For one stupid second, my body still expected comfort from the same place the danger had come from. By morning, the house looked too clean. Evan had always made beds too tightly and lined his shoes under the bench by the front door so the toes pointed in the same direction. One pair was gone. The rest were still there in their careful little row like evidence from a life that had not bothered to tell the truth. My phone lit up twice before 8. The first text was from Mara. Give him some space, don't make this bigger than it has to be. The second was from Evan. I meant what I said last night, I need a few days. I read both and set the phone face down on the kitchen table. Then I made coffee and stood in my mother's robe, thin pink cotton frayed at one cuff, still hanging on the pantry hook all these years later, watching steam gather on the window over the sink. There were things about my marriage I'd been rearranging in my own mind for months, not dramatic things, small edits. Evan asking more often what would really make sense long term. Evan wanting copies of papers I'd never needed help managing. Evan using phrases like dead capital and underleveraged when he talked about the house. The first time he called it underleveraged, I laughed because I thought he was joking. He did not laugh back. Even then, I did not fight. I translated. He's worried about money. He's trying to feel included. He grew up different from you. He doesn't understand what this place is. I had gotten good at translation after my mother died. Richard liked everything in the clearest, hardest terms possible. Mara admired that about him. I learned young that there were rewards for not making emotions inconvenient. Richard called me easy. Mara called me sweet. By the time I was 23, I could swallow an insult and hand back a napkin with a thank you smile. It had felt like survival then. Somewhere along the way, it had started to look too much like character. At 10, I called Margaret Sloan. Her office was above an insurance agency in a brick building downtown with frosted glass on the door and a brass plaque that looked older than both of us. I had not seen her since a few months after the funeral when she sat with me in my mother's will in a room that smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish and told me in a voice so matter-of-fact it almost steadied me that grief did not make me less entitled to understand legal language. When I gave my name to her receptionist, Margaret herself opened the door to the inner hall and looked out at me over her glasses. Clara Bennett, she said. Come in. She was in her 60s now, silver-haired and upright with a navy cardigan buttoned all the way up and the same dry, precise manner I remembered. Her office had framed courthouse sketches on one wall and 2 stacks of labeled file boxes on the floor. She did not offer false warmth. That was one reason I trusted her. I set the packet and my old deed file on her desk. I'm sorry if this is nothing. She slid the papers toward herself. People say that when they already know it is not nothing. I sat very still while she read. She didn't hurry. She moved each page into a second pile when she finished, then tapped the corner square. The quiet in the room felt different from the quiet at home. This quiet held shape. Finally, she looked up. Did you sign any of this numbered good? The word went through me so fast it almost made me angry. Good, as if I had been standing at the edge of something I had not fully understood. As if part of me already knew that. Margaret touched the top page with one finger. This would not have transferred full ownership, but it would have created a structure that diluted your sole control substantially. Occupancy, refinancing, leverage, survivorship implications, future claim complexity. For a young marriage, it would have been a very unwise thing to sign without independent counsel. Young marriage. The phrase made me flush like I had shown up as a girl instead of a woman. I kept being told it was about trust, I said. Margaret's mouth tightened a fraction. People often use emotional language when they want legal access without legal scrutiny. I looked down at my hands. My thumb was rubbing the edge of one paper so hard I almost tore it. She left it to me because I was living there, I said quietly. That's what everybody always says. Margaret leaned back. Your mother left it to you because she wanted you to have a place no one could outvote you in. I lifted my head. She opened my old deed file, working carefully through the worn folders I had brought from the cabinet at home. Insurance records, tax receipts, the survey map with its thin black parcel lines. Then she paused over a cream envelope tucked behind an old homeowner's policy. That wasn't in my copy, she said. I frowned. What is it? Open it. My name was on the front in my mother's handwriting. Not lawyer handwriting, not funeral handwriting. The slanted familiar letters from grocery lists and birthday cards and the notes she used to tuck into my lunchbox when I was little. For a second I could not breathe right. My fingers would not work. Margaret handed me a letter opener and I slid it under the flap like I was trying not to wake someone. Inside was a single folded sheet. Clara, if this is ever being opened because people are making you feel guilty for needing your own footing, read this twice. The room blurred. I blinked and started again. You come from me, and that means you will try too hard to keep peace in a room that would not keep peace for you. Don't confuse love with surrender. Don't let anybody make kindness sound holier than self-respect. This house is not everything, but it is one thing in this life that is meant to stay under your hand unless you freely, joyfully decide otherwise. Not because somebody is disappointed, not because somebody says marriage means proving yourself, and not because you are afraid they'll love you less if you say no. I stopped there and put my hand over my mouth. Margaret looked away without pretending not to see. My mother had written the thing I had been refusing to name, not the deed issue. Me, the way I bent, the way I made other people's comfort into a moral obligation. She had known it before I did. She knew I said, and my voice broke on the second word. Yes, Margaret said. I think she did. I cried then, not loudly, not beautifully, just in the humiliating, breath-catching way adults cry when something reaches back through years and touches a bruise exactly where it has been living. It cost me more than the legal explanation had. The law only told me I'd been cornered. My mother's letter told me she had seen the shape of the corner a long time ago. When I finally stood to leave, Margaret made copies of the transfer packet and the note. Do not sign anything, she said. Do not discuss changing ownership without your own counsel. And Clara, I turned back. This was not drafted in your interest. Outside, the afternoon had gone grey and old snow had turned to slush in the gutters. I sat in my car with the engine off and the copies in my lap. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Evan. I stared at his name until the ringing stopped. A minute later, Mara called. I let that go too. By the time I got home, both of them had left voicemails. I did not listen. I went straight to the whole cabinet and pulled out the rest of the household folders, then the shallow basket on top where I kept spare chargers, old stamps, and the tablet Evan had given Mara last Christmas when her laptop died. She had used it at our house more than once to pull up recipes or show me cabinet paint colors, and a few weeks ago she had logged into her messages from it while we were at the table. I remembered because I had teased her for never fully trusting any device that wasn't hers. I plugged it in mostly because I wanted a distraction that felt mechanical. The screen lit after a minute, still synced to her messages. I told myself not to look. Then a preview banner slid across the top before I could even close it. Mara, if she keeps digging in, leaving may be the only thing that makes her realistic. My skin went cold so fast my teeth clicked together. I opened the thread. There were weeks of messages, not dozens, not hundreds, just enough to know. Enough to ruin every merciful version of events I'd been trying to build. Evan, I'm trying to do this gently. Mara, gentle, hasn't moved anything. Evan, Richard thinks once she's alone in there again, she'll stop treating the place like holy ground. Mara, she hears house and turns back into a child. Evan, I hate that it has to happen this way. Mara, then stop dragging it out. The dates were there in plain grey numbers, February 4th, February 6th, February 10th. Once she's alone in there again. I sat down on the hallway floor with the tablet in my hands and leaned my head back against the cabinet door. The wood was cool through my hair. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator motor kicked on. The whole house seemed to draw away from me for a moment, not because it was gone, but because I finally understood the shape of what had been happening inside it. They had not been reacting to my grief. They had been using it. Every conversation about trust, every softened suggestion, every patient sigh, every mention of building a future, none of it had been neutral. It had all been pressure with a nicer coat on, and Evan had not left because the marriage broke in one bad Valentine's Day argument. He had left because the slow campaign had failed and they thought loneliness would finish what persuasion had not. My phone started ringing again in my coat pocket, buzzing against the hardwood by my hip. Evan. I looked at his name and felt for the first time since he walked out something cleaner than hurt. Not peace, not yet. Clarity. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I rose, walked into the kitchen and set Margaret's copies in a neat stack beside my mother's letter. The pink tulips were opening too wide now, their stems bent in the jar. I took one of the good pens from the crock by the stove and wrote 3 names on the back of an old electric bill envelope. Mara, Richard, Evan. Then I looked at the clock, picked up my phone and decided I was done trying to save the marriage privately. It was the story itself I was going to confront. I called Mara first because she was the one most likely to think she could manage me. I told her I wanted to clear the air and asked if she and Richard could come by that evening. I kept my voice even, tired if anything, and she relaxed almost immediately into the role she liked best. That's probably for the best, she said. Everybody's emotions are a little overheated. Everybody. I said Evan should be there too. She paused just long enough for me to hear the calculation, then told me she would let him know. By 5:30, the sky had already started dimming, that flat gray February dusk that made the bare trees behind the fence look drawn in pencil. I turned on the lamp in the living room but left the overhead light off. The house looked softer that way, less like a place waiting to be examined and more like itself. I moved my mother's letter, Margaret's copies, the transfer packet, and the printed screenshots from Mara's tablet into one stack on the coffee table. Then I sat on the far end of the sofa with my hands folded in my lap and listened to the furnace kick on. I was not calm because I had forgiven anything. I was calm because grief had finally stopped running in circles and found a shape. Richard and Mara arrived together. Mara came in first in a camel coat and heeled boots, already taking in the room with a brisk managerial glance. Richard followed with his shoulders hunched against the cold, his wool cap still in one hand. Neither of them brought flowers. Neither of them looked embarrassed. Evan came 10 minutes later. When I opened the door, he had that same careful expression he wore when he wanted to seem kind in a conflict. His overnight bag was gone. He smelled faintly of aftershave and winter air. For a second, seeing his face in the porch light, something in my body remembered him as home before the rest of me caught up. He stepped inside and looked at the papers on the coffee table. His eyes flicked up to mine. "What is this, a conversation?" I said. We all sat in the living room, not the dining room. I wanted no echo of Valentine's Day table manners. Mara crossed her legs and set her purse beside her feet. Richard leaned back in the armchair with both hands on his knees. Evan sat nearest the edge of the sofa cushion opposite me, like a man prepared to be patient with difficulty. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Mara did exactly what I had known she would do. "Clara," she said gently, "before this turns into something it doesn't need to be, I want to say again that nobody is against you. Everybody's just worried this has gotten too emotional." I looked at her. Really looked at her, at the smooth concern in her face, at the way she could polish a blade until it looked like advice. Too emotional for what I asked. Her eyes narrowed a fraction. "For reason." Richard cleared his throat. "Honey, I think we all know this house carries a lot for you, but that doesn't mean Evan was wrong to want a marriage that felt shared." There it was. The old script. Concern. Reason. Shared. Nothing ugly enough to point at without sounding unstable. For years I'd made the mistake of responding to the words instead of the pattern. Evan leaned forward, elbows on his thighs. "I never wanted this to become a trial." "No," I said. "You wanted it to stay a conversation." He blinked. I reached for the top paper in the stack and laid it on the table between us. This transfer packet was prepared on February 3rd. Nobody moved. I set down the second page, then the third. "You left on Valentine's Day and told me you were stepping back because you couldn't live inside my mistrust anymore. But these were drafted 11 days before that dinner. So either the marriage was already being handled like paperwork before you walked out, or you expect me to believe this all became urgent in the same week." Richard shifted in his chair. Mara opened her mouth, but I lifted my hand just slightly, and for the first time in my life she stopped. "I'm not finished." The silence that followed felt so new it was almost loud. Evan sat back. "I asked for documents to be drafted because we needed clarity. That doesn't mean I plan to leave." "No," I said. "It means you planned for me to move." His face changed then, not dramatically, just enough for me to see I had finally touched the real thing. Mara's voice sharpened. "That is not fair." I turned to her. What wasn't fair was talking about my house like I was a child clinging to a dollhouse. Her chin lifted. "You have been treating it like a shrine. I nodded once. Thank you. She frowned. For what? For saying it out loud the way you mean it. I picked up Margaret's copies and laid them on top of the packet. I met with Margaret Sloane this morning. She reviewed the deed structure, the proposed transfer, and the original estate paperwork. She was very clear. My mother set this house up to remain under my sole control. Deliberately. The documents you wanted me to sign would not have made things more equal. They would have weakened my ownership. Richard gave a soft, irritated exhale. Lawyers always make things sound more dramatic than they are. Then maybe you'd prefer my mother's version. That landed. I unfolded the letter slowly. The paper made a dry, delicate sound in the room. My throat tightened the instant I saw her handwriting again, but this time I did not hide from it. I found this in the deed file today, I said. It was addressed to me. Nobody spoke. I read the lines that mattered. I read them carefully because I wanted every word to stand on its own feet. Don't confuse love with surrender. Don't let anybody make kindness sound holier than self-respect. This house is not everything, but it is one thing in this life that is meant to stay under your hand, unless you freely, joyfully decide otherwise. Not because somebody is disappointed. Not because somebody says marriage means proving yourself. When I finished, the room went so still I could hear the refrigerator hum from the kitchen. Richard looked down first. Not Evan. Not Mara. Richard. His jaw worked once, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not have a practical sentence ready. Mara recovered before the others. That doesn't prove anyone was plotting against you. It proves your mother knew you could be stubborn. The old Clara would have flinched. The old Clara would have tried to explain why that was unfair, why that hurt, why she wasn't stubborn, only careful. Instead, I reached for the printed screenshots and slid them across the table until they stopped in front of her purse. These do. Mara stared at them. Richard leaned forward. Evan did not touch his at all. I watched their eyes move. If she keeps digging in, leaving may be the only thing that makes her realistic. Once she's alone in there again, she'll stop treating the place like holy ground. Gentle hasn't moved anything. Nobody said a word for several seconds. Then Evan stood. Those are private messages. I looked up at him. Yes, that's what makes them honest. His face flushed dark at the edges. You don't know the context. I know enough context to understand that my husband did not leave because we had one painful dinner. He left because pressure didn't work and you thought loneliness might. That is not what happened. It is exactly what happened. Mara pushed the papers away from her as though they had become physically dirty. You are reading the worst possible intent into everything. No, I said. I spent 3 years doing the opposite. My voice did not rise. That was what made them finally hear it. I looked at Evan. I explained you to yourself every time something felt wrong. When you asked for copies of my documents, when you called the house underleveraged, when you stopped saying home and started saying property, when you let my sister and Richard discuss my mother's house like I was standing outside my own life listening through a window. I kept translating because I thought that was what good women did when they loved someone. I thought being calm would keep me safe. Evan swallowed. Clara, no. I shook my head. You don't get to use my name like that now. The color drained from his face. I was never difficult to love, I said. I was difficult to move. That was the moment the room changed. Not because anybody apologized. Not because I won them over. Because the sentence was true and every other sentence they had used against me suddenly sounded arranged around avoiding it. Richard rubbed a hand over his mouth. Mara looked furious now, but the fury had nowhere clean to go. Evan sat back down slowly as if his knees had failed him in private before they did it in public. What do you want? He asked quietly. It was such a small question after all that pressure. So much of his moral authority had depended on acting as if I were the one asking too much. Now he sounded like a man who had just discovered the room no longer belonged to him. I want the truth where everyone can see it, I said. And I want you to understand this house is not being transferred, merged, adjusted, leveraged, or discussed as if my grief made me unqualified to own it. Not now. Not later. And as for us, my throat tightened on the word. Not because I doubted myself, but because something once tender was still dying where I could feel it. As for us, you do not get to call what you did a hard choice inside a marriage. You aligned yourself with people who thought my loneliness would make me easier to handle. That is not marriage. That is strategy. Evan lowered his eyes. Richard finally spoke, but he sounded older than he had 2 hours earlier. Clara, he said, I never meant I know I said. And I did. That was part of what made all of it so poisonous. None of them thought of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as practical. They thought intent mattered more than effect. They thought if the tone stayed civilized, the damage would count less. It still happened, I said. No one argued with that. They left one by one awkwardly with coats and keys in the fragile silence of people no longer sure what version of themselves they could wear out the door. Evan was the last. At the threshold he turned as if there were something left to recover. There was a time I loved you, he said. I stood in the hall beneath the mirror where he had left the envelope 2 nights before. Maybe, I said, but not more than you loved what you thought would come with me. He closed his eyes once. Then he left. The house settled around me after that in small sounds. Pipes, heat, wind against the back fence. I took the wine glasses from Valentine's Day out of the sink where I had abandoned them and washed them carefully one at a time with my sleeves pushed up and the kitchen window cracked open to the cold. Evan called a little after 9. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of tone. Clara. I waited. I handled this badly. Yes. A long pause. I could hear traffic in the background where he was the soft wash of cars on wet pavement. I never wanted to lose you over this. I looked down at my hand resting on the counter. Soap had dried along the base of my thumb in a pale line. You lost me when you decided my no was a problem to solve, I said. Please don't do this tonight. I almost laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because even now he thought timing might still belong to him. Goodbye, Evan. I hung up before he could make his voice smaller. Afterward, I took my mother's brass key from the drawer by the phone. It was heavier than modern keys, old and warm-toned from years of use, the edges softened by hands before mine. I slipped on my coat and stepped out the back door onto the porch. The air had that late winter bite that made your eyes water if you breathed too deeply. The yard was dark except for the weak amber spill from the kitchen window. Along the porch beam, the hook where my mother's wind chime used to hang was still there, empty all these years because I had wrapped the chime in newspaper after she died and could never quite bear to hear it again. I had brought it out that afternoon without fully knowing why. It was sitting now on the porch bench beside me, the metal tubes dull with dust, the little wooden striker nicked at one edge. I stood with the brass key in my palm and the chime in my other hand, listening to the quiet. Then I reached up and rehung it. For a moment nothing happened, just the scrape of the hook, the shift of metal, my own breathing clouding in front of me. Then a thin current of air moved across the porch and the chime answered. Not brightly, not like a miracle, just a low clear sound in the cold, small and real and completely itself. I stayed there until the dusk deepened into night, my hands still closed around the key, listening to that sound come and go, and for the first time in a very long while the house did not feel like something I was trying to keep. It felt like something that had finally kept me.